Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the MyNHPCO Bereavement Professional Community Chat in the Morning Store, American Grief in the Civil War. Now I'd like to introduce the presenter for today, Reverend Dr. Don Stouder, Volunteer Manager and Bereavement Counselor at Reliance Hospice in Palm Desert, California, as well as the Bereavement Professional Steering Committee. Welcome, everybody.
Well, good morning / good afternoon to everybody in the audience today. My name is Don Stouder. I'll be presenting the topic in the Morning Store, American Grief in the Civil War, where we're going to try to learn a little bit about where some of the ways that we deal with grief in America comes from. I, of course, want to invite you to introduce yourselves over in the chat section, if you like. Maybe tell us where you're from and what the weather's like there today. I'm in the California desert, Palm Springs area. It's about 103 degrees right now, going up to 110. And finally, a lovely day. We've had some cloudy, rainy, stormy monsoon weather, and it's quite nice today. So tell us where you're from and what you're up to. Next slide, please. So this whole My NHPCO thing, we always like to talk a little bit about at the beginning. It's really a community, right? And this is how you can get to it, mynhpco.org, with your email and password. It's a great collaboration of discipline-specific professional communities with lots and lots of resources. Next slide, please. Those include professional communities that have discussion posts and monthly chats and library entries and a blog. And while I'm talking about professional communities, our bereavement steering committee is a great group, and we're always looking for members. But if you happen to be a nurse, or if you happen to be a chaplain, spiritual care provider, those two committees and communities really need people to help them out. So reach out to NHPCO if that's something you'd be interested in. Next slide, please. Of course, contact us here on the committee or Emma at NHPCO if you have questions about membership, if you have any topics you'd like us to discuss, and if there's something that you'd like to present, we'd love to hear about it. If you want to become a community member, and of course, if you have any other questions about staying connected with the Bereavement Professionals Committee. So the city of Palm Springs, California, and its surrounding communities are all a part of the Coachella Valley, which stretches from the Banning Pass and the mountains of Big Bear to the north, all the way southeast some 75 miles to the Salton Sea and Imperial County, where most of your winter vegetables come from. It sits at the crossroads of two great southwestern deserts, the Mojave Desert and the Sonoran Desert. All of us at Reliance Hospice acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, the Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians, and we recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. With humility and gratitude, we pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future. Next slide, please. A little bit of quick housekeeping. We call it a chat because we really want you to participate. I see lots of you already are. Keep that up. Feel free to type in your questions in the chat feature, side of your screen, and or the Q&A section. We want to give everybody a chance to share their experiences. Emma already told you how you can do that if you want to speak. We'll offer suggestions, but of course, we welcome your participation and input. Next slide, please. So today we're going to try to widen our historical understanding of how Americans grieve. We want to try to understand how the Civil War informed new movements like spiritualism and the contemporary funeral industry. And we want to understand how wars and pandemics can fundamentally change how Americans grieve and how they continue to inform various religions and cultures up to the present day. Next slide, please. I do want to drop a little trigger warning in here. I'm not going to show you any dramatically graphic pictures, but of course that's subjective. So there are going to be some pictures that might upset you. I may use verbal descriptions of graphic things that may be upsetting to some people. I want to make sure we're clear about that as we get going. Next slide, please. Walt Whitman. A lot of people would call him the quintessential American poet, the first real American poet. What a lot of people don't know is his involvement in the Civil War, and I want to tell that story very briefly. He was living, I think, in New York City at the time, and his brother had gone to serve in the Union Army, and he heard word. I think it was through seeing his name in a newspaper article, and we're going to talk about that too. Seeing his name under a list of the wounded, and he didn't know where he was, but he knew he wanted to go find him. So he started his search where almost all Union soldiers were ultimately taken if they were injured and needed some sort of hospital care, and that was the Washington, D.C. area. And so he went down there and searched through the hospitals, eventually found his brother. His brother was okay, and he decided to stay. And in staying, he sort of became a bedside nurse. He also became what I like to think of as one of the first hospital chaplains, in that he would go soldier to soldier, bed to bed, try to comfort the dying, write letters to their family, things like that. He also did a lot of actual medical work assisting nurses. And I want to sort of bookend my presentation with two readings of a poem of his called The Wound Dresser. The Wound Dresser is a poem about an old man who's being asked what he did in the war by kids, and the rest of it will become self-evident. I'm going to read the first two stanzas to start our presentation off today. An old man bending, I come among new faces, years looking backward, resuming in answer to children. Come tell us, old man, as from young men and maidens that love me, aroused and angry, I'd thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war, but soon my fingers failed me, my face drooped, and I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead. Years hence of these scenes, of these furious passions, these chances of unsurpassed heroes, was one side so brave, the other was equally brave. Now be witness again, paint the mightiest armies of earth. Of those armies so rapid, so wondrous, what saw you to tell us? What stays with you latest and deepest, of curious panics, of hard-fought engagements or sieges tremendous? What deepest remains? O maidens and young men I love and that love me, what you ask of my days, though strangest and sudden your talking recalls. Soldier alert, I arrive after a long march, covered with sweat and dust. In the nick of time I come, plunge in the fight, loudly shout in the rush of successful charge. Enter the captured works, yet lo, like a swift running river they fade, pass and are gone they fade. I dwell not on soldiers' perils or soldiers' joys, both I remember well. Many of the hardships, few the joys, yet I was content. But in silence, in dreams' projections, while the world of gain and appearance and mirth goes on, so soon what is forgotten, and waves wash the imprints off the sand. With hinged knees returning, I enter the doors. While for you up there, whoever you are, follow without noise and be of strong heart. Bearing the bandages, water and sponge, straight and swift to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground, or to the rows of the hospital tent, or under the roofed hospital. To the long rows of cots up and down, each side I return. To each and all, one after another I draw near. Not one do I miss. An attendant follows holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. I onward go. I stop, with hinged knees and steady hand, to dress wounds. I'm firm with each. The pangs are sharp yet unavoidable. One turns to me his appealing eyes, poor boy. I never knew you. Yet I think I could not refuse this moment to die for you, if that would save you. Next slide. So The title of my talk, a number of people have asked me about. In the spring of 1863, Lord and Taylor in New York, in a place, part of New York City they called Ladies' Mile, opened what they called a mourning store, spelled Mouring. And it specialized, of course, in clothing that new widows of the Civil War could dress their grief in what they called, quote unquote, suitable fashion. Lots of black fabrics and black crepe that were imported from all over the country. Next slide, please. America has had many experiences of losing a lot of its citizens with wars and pandemics. I've always been struck by President Biden's description looking at this COVID memorial on the National Mall, 1 million empty chairs around the dinner table. It's as if after each one of these experiences, we try to make sense of it. We try to make meaning. That meaning making started for Americans, for the most part, around the time of the Civil War. Next slide, please. And of course, COVID isn't the only pandemic that many of us have lived through, and that many of us had to find ways to make meaning of. And yet, it was in the meaning making that helped all of us move through our grief. And this, of course, is the scene of the Names Project National Memorial Quilt, also shown in Washington. Next slide. For a lot of people, their first experience of really getting to know about the Civil War and what it meant for America was through Ken Burns' PBS film called The Civil War. It certainly is the first thing that turned me on. Even though I grew up on the East Coast, I grew up near Civil War battlefields. We talked about it a lot in the schools I attended. I didn't hear really, really true, relevant information about it until Ken Burns' film. And if you haven't seen this, I strongly, strongly recommend you rent it or download it. It's pretty widely available. It's a series that goes on, I think, for 6 or 8 long episodes. It's painful, it's hard, but one of the things you come away from it with is this notion of wow, I understand where a lot of the things that are a part of American culture today in this century originally came from. Next slide. In the Civil War, neighbors killed each other and family members killed each other, and people from the North killed the South, and people from the South killed people from the North. It turned out to be a bloody war of attrition where the firepower on both sides so overwhelmed each other that the soldiers mostly just stood there and watched each other die. The scale, just the sheer unimaginable scale of the dying really disillusioned an entire country, and also, as President Lincoln saw, gave us a country. He would talk a lot about how the Civil War turned a provisional arrangement of states into a modern nation. Next slide, please. There were lots of popular paintings during the time of the Civil War. This is certainly one of them. It's also very accurate, and if you look closely, you see line after line of opposing people holding their rifles all the way up to their shoulder and essentially aiming at each other's heads at close range. And this, of course, it led to that huge, huge number of casualties that we saw on the previous slide. Next slide, please. The paintings never really told the real story. The real story was in people who were there and in some of the photographs that were distributed at the time. And I think it's also important and worth noting that this was the social media of the time. Photography was pretty new at the time of the Civil War. Next slide, please. This, of course, is Gettysburg, and the pictures that I'm showing you are tame. There were much, much worse ones that I could have chosen. College president and author Drew Faust wrote a book called The Republic of Suffering. And in her argument, it's the scale of the killing between 1861 and 1865 that demanded what she calls a new cult of memory. a new set of social rituals, some that were rooted in the Bible, but many that were really secular, the rituals of national mourning. And to quote her, these rituals, the response to the mass killing from military cemeteries neatly rowed to a taste for tight-lipped prose, made us what we are. The embalming fluid developed at the time by Yankee ingenuity to preserve dead bodies on their way home from the battlefield still runs through our veins, unquote. Next slide. So things changed as a result of this extraordinary killing. One witness, S.H.M. Byers was his name, of Iowa, quotes, remembered one terrible battle where lines of blue and gray stood together and fired into each other's faces for an hour and a half. The things that changed as a result of that, of course, included Victorian mourning customs. We'll talk about how almost all funerals and mourning was all home-based. The emergence of funeral homes as a money-making opportunity, the emergence of caskets and embalming, the emergence of women's roles in very dramatic ways, understanding what our obligations to the dead were, and of course, grand public funerals that never really existed before. Next slide, please. At its core, the Civil War really challenged what Americans had come to know as the good death. It was always something that happened at home, and it happened in the presence of loved ones, both the death itself and the mourning. And of course, death was very familiar to folks in that time in America. And these transitional practices that they used brought comfort to everyone involved. That's what they were designed to do. Next slide, please. One of the things that emerged was this sense of public grief. To deal with these horrors, sort of this new set of social rituals came into play. And they were designed not so much to blind survivors to the reality as to make them believe that the reality was necessary and noble. That's important, to make them believe that the reality was necessary and noble. Faust's book shows how thoroughly the work of mourning became the business of capitalism, sort of merchandise through a society. And another big part of that were these spectacles of grief, or large public funerals. Now, obviously, this picture I'm showing you is not from the Civil War. I think this is President Bush #1's funeral, but you can draw a direct line from this all the way back to Lincoln's funeral, because that's when those grand public displays really began. Next slide, please. It's a larger picture of one that you saw a couple slides ago, but it's a picture of Lincoln's funeral parade, so to speak, as it moved through Philadelphia. And this is an accurate painting in terms of how grand it was. Next slide. He would go on in the Gettysburg Address to really try to paint a picture of how he saw the reason for the Civil War, what he called these honored dead that died so a nation might live. So for him, for Lincoln, the nation itself becomes the product of the sacrifice. There's this sense of obligation to the nation, to the principles for which the war was fought. For him, it was a war about citizenship and equality and emancipation and the values that should define America. Next slide. I want to read you this letter because it also draws an interesting line between the past and the present. This is Lincoln writing to a mother who lost several of her children, and that wasn't particularly unusual at that time. November 21, 1864, Dear Madam, I've been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you're the mother of 5 sons who've died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming, but I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost, and the sullen pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, A. Lincoln. And notice in each one of those 3 paragraphs, he drops a sentence or a line in about how this is all about this enormous yet needed sacrifice to help save the nation. He was always very aware of that in all the public comments that he made. The other interesting thing about this letter, my father served in the Korean War. And when he died several years ago, he was interred at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego. And at his service, a naval officer presented me with a flag, and the words he used was, "On behalf of the President of the United States, we thank you and your family for your sacrifice." And I can draw a line between that moment and this letter, because it was the Civil War, it was these practices where this public recognition began, where it first began, that we owed something to folks that went and fought for us. Next slide. The National Morning Store included lots of things, inspirational poems and high rhetoric, along with this new practice of embalming with zinc chloride, which marbleized, quote unquote, flesh, and allowed some of the dead at least to travel home for burial in recognizable shape. There was a secondary market in icebox coffins for the same reasons. Faust, in her book, reproduces a full-page ad inserted in the Gettysburg paper soon after the battle for quote-unquote transportation cases that preserve the body in a natural and perfect condition for any distance or length of time. Next slide, please. I talked a minute ago about social media, and another good example are pictures like this. Again, photography is very, very new. This is a battlefield shop, so to speak, that is embalming soldiers and preparing them to go home. Social media, in terms of photography, wasn't the only thing that was kind of new. So was the telegraph around this time. And that's how a lot of people learned the news of the loss of their loved one and began their grief journeys. Next slide, please. So in terms of our obligations to the dead, hang on, we recognize that if we ask people to fight, there's obligations owed to them. For example, we didn't have dog tags until the Civil War. There was no process to identify the dead. We didn't have national cemeteries. An interesting sidebar, when we did have national cemeteries, we only buried Union dead in them. We had no formal next of kin notification. As was the case for Walt Whitman, he found his brother's name on a list of casualties that was printed in the newspaper. Folks relied on the newspapers or letters from friends to get their news. Loss turned out to be the core of many, many women's lives. There was this huge logistic after the war of reburying about 300,000 bodies who their families wanted or the state wanted moved elsewhere. There was no pension system for relatives that was brought into a reality, as was a government that was big enough to be able to handle those things. The Civil War saw the development of sanitary commissions, the early hospitals, and the American Red Cross. The notion that the dead of war must be heroes in order to make sense of their death. And that leads into the next thing, which is there must be something more than simple mourning after death. We must make meaning. Next slide. So I want to stop for a second and take a breath and give all of you the opportunity to ask a question if you'd like, and to give my panel, who I'm on here with, an opportunity to comment if they would like.
I agree with Deborah. I think that letter from Lincoln is just so powerful, and it's really beautiful that there was recognition for that individual who had lost so many family members. That has to be an extremely traumatic experience.
Anybody else like to make a comment or ask a question? I know I just parked an enormous amount of very heavy material on you, and it probably takes a moment to sort of absorb.
I thought the when you showed I learned a lot from when you showed the funeral, the public funeral, the public viewings. And I never really, or just let me say, I understand it in a different concept from what you said, what that meant.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, was the funeral business happening in Europe or Asia too?
That's a great question, and I have no idea. It'd be interesting to look into that. Was this a phenomenon that started in the States, or had other things been happening? I mean, certainly historically, we know that there were different funeral and burial rites in different cultures in Europe and Asia, but the funeral business per se, I don't know the answer to that.
Kristen Emerson posted a question in the Q&A. She lives in Richmond with a ton of Civil War history, of course.
Yeah.
Can you explain the historical mourning symbolism with so many Confederate general statuses?
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Is it about perhaps why there was a large number of monuments built to Confederate generals?
Let's see. For instance, she heard the statuses represented a collective grief expression. So I guess statues. Sorry. Okay.
I thought statuses too.
Wait.
Yeah, statue. My bad. Represented a collective grief expression.
Yeah, so my answer to that would be I agree. I absolutely agree. It was a collective grief expression, and I am not for a moment going to defend current movements to remove statues, because in many ways I agree with that. But I think it is helpful to understand why they were put there. It was about grief. I would argue it was about collective grief. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, next slide.
We got a couple more Q&As, sorry.
Okay.
Molly said that she's sitting with grief of the institution of slavery, which was the insidious backdrop of the Civil War. And she's wondering if you or anyone on the panel would like to speak on this.
I'm gonna ask her to put that on hold till we come to the end of the presentation, because I'm gonna address it in a couple of different places as we move forward.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, one more question. Kurt said this touches on the political nature of grief, of disenfranchising some groups because it conflicts with our narratives. How can we include opposing and even contradictory narratives to allow meaning for all of us?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I'd like to sit with that, but does anybody else on the panel want to address it? Take a shot at it?
I would just really say, Dr. Dunn, I think you're doing a great job with this historical perspective. And as I'm sitting doing a presentation right now, working on a presentation on families and grief, I think these questions just reminds me of how much history, even if these people have been gone for 300 years, 200 years, but how much history still impacts our grief experience. Yeah. And it's so, I don't know if there's ever good answers, but I think the most important thing, as you're explaining, is to recognize it, and to recognize why then our individual grief experiences, why they are what they are.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this was a fairly famous painting in the South, and meant a lot to the South in terms of showing the perspective of especially how women's roles changed. So around 1862, a 29-year-old captain named William Laton is killed in battle, and his body is brought to a plantation a few miles away from where he was buried. And the plantation's white men were all away serving the Confederate Army, but Mrs. Brockenbrough, who was the mistress of the house, assured his brother that those remains would be rendered proper care with a Christian burial. So the next day, slaves from Westwood and the neighboring family plantation of Summerhill prepare the body, constructed a coffin, and according to the story that circulated at the time, the mistress of the house sent one of the slaves to retrieve the family minister, but Union armies hindered his arrival. And so without any men to assist them, the women performed the funeral themselves. And so that would be incredibly unusual for a woman, not only to have a voice either in the North or the South, but to perform a ritual that was virtually always prepared by conducted by men. There was a famous poem written about that event, and it's very brief. No man of God might read the burial rite above the rebel. Thus declared the foe that blanched before him in the deadly fight. But women's voice, in accents soft and low, trembling with pity, touched with pathos, read over his hallowed dust the ritual of the dead. And so that hits the local papers, and then this painting is distributed probably about a year or two later. But I wanted to use it here because it touched really well, I thought, on how so many women's roles changed as a result of the Civil War. Next slide, please. So a lot of individuals, of course, find themselves asking questions. What does death mean? What is heaven like? Do I really believe in a benevolent God if he allows these unimaginably horrible things to occur? What does it mean to be a human being and confront this incredible level of inhumanity? Again, in her book, Faust describes this notion of a Protestant cult of the afterlife, which sort of developed, which had a kind of a folk art sense in terms of American sermonizing. Heaven was not merely a general idea of glory, but a particular idea of reincarnation. In the afterlife, you wouldn't just linger as a well-meaning spirit, you'd get your whole body back, good as new. Again, Faust writes, a vision of heaven that literally restored bodies to wholeness may have been powerfully compelling to men in such circumstances as the Civil War. We do not have evidence that soldiers consciously risked their lives and the very real possibilities of physical disfigurement because they knew that they would be fully restored in heaven. But the hearty belief in the restoration of full and glorious literal bodies in heaven could not have been far from their minds in a culture that was rife with the idea. Next slide, please. So now we enter the asking of the question, what the heck was going on in Western New York? And I'm asking that question because it leads directly into my conversation about some of the responses to all this loss in terms of how people grieved. There was this huge 19th century religious fervor in Western and Central New York. They called it the burned over district to describe how the spirit burned over the whole land. This was the time when Latter-day Saints or Mormons were discovered, the Shakers, the circuit riders of Methodism, a movement called the Millerites, which really believed in an immediate second coming. The Fox sisters, who discovered spiritualism, and we're going to spend a lot of time getting to know them, and also really significant social justice movements led by women, one of the most significant being Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her work in women's suffrage and abolition in Seneca Falls. Next slide. I want to spend a few minutes swimming around in the waters of spiritualism because this was a dramatic response to loss. This was a huge way that people dealt with their grief. And it's one of those movements that we can look right at, point a finger at the day that it started and the people that started it. Almost all historians point to it beginning in 1848. And it was because of two sisters, Maggie and Kate Fox, who started to tell people that they were communicating with a spirit in their home. And the way they were communicating with that spirit were through rappings and knockings on their walls and on tables and in different places around their home. Word got out that they're communicating with spirits, and the response to it, again from a grieving nation, was dramatic, right? All of these people would start coming and being audience members in talks they would give and seances. And of course, spiritual mediums were popping up everywhere. It was a new American religion, and it grew very, very rapidly. And of course, it's still a part of the American culture today. Next slide, please. A lot of folks gravitated towards spiritualism because it had two interesting things. Like traditional religions, it believed in the immortality of the soul, but unlike traditional religions, it would give you proof. And the proof was in the form of holding a seance and seeing all these signals come from the people who've passed over to the other side, especially people that you want to talk to, especially folks that you want to know how they're doing and if they're okay, as a way to assuage your own grief. Next slide, please. So for a time, spiritualism was also the only way that women were allowed to speak in public. And of course, this started a women's suffrage movement that never, ever stopped. Female mediums used it as a way to champion the ideas of women's suffrage and equal rights and the abolition of slavery. And this is really interesting. They did this by claiming that these weren't their ideas. God forbid women should have their own ideas, but rather these were messages from the spirit realm. And that is how they more or less managed to get away with it. Next slide, please. So with the onslaught of the Civil War and this growing list of men, lists and lists and lists who would never come home, lots of people turned to spiritualist mediums. And as I said, they were hoping for some proof that their loved one's immortal soul was at peace. So culturally prevalent really was spiritualism at the time that even skeptics and dabblers felt compelled to explore it. People like Mark Twain and Frederick Douglass, and even Queen Victoria, all attended seances, although plenty of people declined to attend so much as a single event. The movement was still hard to avoid. In the span of 4 decades, according to one estimate, a new book about spiritualism was published roughly once a week, and there were periodicals about spiritualism literally everywhere. Next slide, please. As I talked about earlier, before the war, the idea of a good death meant that all these aspects of dying were undertaken in the home. But the Civil War robbed all these families, hundreds of thousands of family members, the chance to be by their loved one's side at the time of their death. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the way it was always done. There was no chance to say a proper goodbye. So an awful lot of people really hungered for the opportunity to have one last message from their loved one. Next slide. Another interesting thing that came along with spiritualism, and I touched on it earlier, is that this was also an era, the mid-19th century, an era where a lot of people's faith was started to be shaken by scientific discoveries, things like fossils, and the geological record began to be talked about. But one of the reasons why spiritualism became so popular was they made it scientific. They aligned it with scientific movements that were going on at the time. Seances, they would say, were scientific and produced under test conditions. Next slide. Another thing that was a part of the spiritualist movement that continues to this day is the sense that spiritualist mediums have healing powers, whether that be through prayer or touch. At the times, the practitioners would either touch or wave their hands over their patients, quote unquote, mesmerizing them and healing them and restoring health. Next slide. I talked a minute ago about the scientific parallels with spiritualism, and one of the things that was interesting is I mentioned the telegraph was new. The telegraph used the Morse alphabet, which are dots and dashes. And that is what the sisters, Fox sisters, spoke to with their knocks. It was a spiritual Morse code. The other interesting thing at the time were photographers who would say that they could take pictures of your loved ones, and probably the most famous, your loved ones who were gone, departed. And probably the most famous of those was Mary Todd Lincoln, having her picture taken with her husband, President Lincoln, in the background, long after he'd been assassinated. She lost so many children that long before this, she had started having mediums visit her in the White House, and after she left the White House, she was a grieving widow and a grieving mother right to the very end. This is probably one of the last photographs taken of her. Next picture, please. An awful lot of believers and skeptics were famous people. One of the biggest believers that went around especially pointing out why spiritualism could help comfort grieving family members was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who of course was the father of Sherlock Holmes. Next slide. Eventually, there would an industry would start to ramp up to supply folks who were spiritualist mediums, and this is a catalog. This picture is a catalog of supplies for mediums. And of course, eventually, Maggie Fox, one of the Fox sisters, who actually invented, for lack of a better word, spiritualism, confessed that they'd faked those rappings and knockings by cracking their knuckles and joints together. And they actually put them on stage at one point so they could demonstrate how it was that they cracked their knuckles and the joints of their toes together. In spite of that, as you'll see in a minute, spiritualism continues very strongly to this day. Next slide. A famous musician, no less formidable than Harry Houdini, made it part of his life's work to expose spiritualism. He thought everything about it was a fake and did everything he could to expose it in debates, and he would storm into public events that were conducted by spiritualists and declare that he could prove they were fakes. He was on quite a roll, and that lasted his entire life. Next slide. A lot of people thought of spiritualism as something that was only in the North, but it was in the South. At that time, the real difference was it was sort of incorporated into what was then evangelical Christianity. And so instead of communicating with the departed in seances, they did it at revivals and revival meetings. Next slide. And of course, spiritualism wasn't only a quote-unquote white movement. There were a lot of Black spiritualists, including Sojourner Truth, who lived for a decade in a spiritual community called Harmonia before she settled in Battle Creek, Michigan. And many famous Black mediums, Beverly Randolph, Rebecca Cox Jackson, both of whom wrote books that included their work with spirits. Harriet E. Wilson, who was one of the first Black authors to publish a novel in the United States, later became a spiritualist healer who was known, like some of her white counterparts, for summoning indigenous spirits, and who was described in one of Boston's spiritualist newspapers as the quote-unquote eloquent and earnest trance medium. One of the things that Sojourner Truth did, though, very clearly, was she used this platform as a social justice platform. She was fairly intentional about that. Next slide. And so we shoot ahead to present day. This particular article I'm going to talk about was written in 2021. And it asks the question, why did so many Victorians try to speak with the dead? And I think we've established to some degree that they did this as a response to their grief. A huge collective response to a huge, unimaginable loss. Next slide. The author of that article, Casey Kepp, starts the article off with this paragraph, which I'd like to read. It's a good time to be dead, at least if you want to keep in touch with the living. Almost a third of Americans, this is present day, by the way, almost a third of Americans say they've communicated with someone who's died, and they collectively spend more than $2 billion with a B dollars a year for psychic services on platforms old and new. Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, television, whatever the medium, there's a medium. Like clairvoyants in centuries past, those of today also fill auditoriums, lecture halls, and retreats. Historic camps such as Lilydale in New York and Casadega in Florida are booming, with tens of thousands of people visiting every year to attend seances, worship, healing services, and readings. And many people turn up not every year, but every week. There are more than 100 spiritualist churches in the United States, more than 300 in the United Kingdom, and hundreds of others in more than 30 countries around the world. Next slide, please. I wanted to take a picture of Lilydale's website and put it up just to give you a sense of their size and certainly presence. If any of you are from Western New York or probably anywhere in New York State, you're familiar with them. It's a large community. It's not just a retreat center, but there are many, many, many homes there where folks who are spiritualism followers can live in community. Next slide. He ends, Casey Kepp, he ends, he or she actually, I'm not sure which, ends this article with this, which I think in many ways sums up my presentation today, but also where people are at and the reasons why they look to things like spiritualism. The dread of mortality has always inspired the dream of immortality, and the hopes that animated Victorian spiritualism are eternal. To bridge the divide between ourselves and those we have lost, to know that they're safe and content, and to believe that they're thinking of us just as much as we're thinking of them. Next slide. And so again, I want to offer up a minute for some questions. There'll be another opportunity past this as well, but I'd like to invite you all to sort of connect the dots. Right? Connect the dots of what I've been talking about, this historical experience of loss and the expressions of grief that followed, and how you understand how we do that in a contemporary way. And I'd invite your questions and comments from the panel as well.
There are a couple of comments in the chat box. And it also includes a couple of questions. One question, I wonder if the earlier ideas of grief care, Freud, being the severing connection with your loved one after death was also in opposition to spiritualism. And Debbie mentioned continuing bonds.
Yeah, to the first question, I would answer a big fat yes. I think the whole idea of seances was not to have to sever the connection that you had in life. The second one you mentioned again?
Let's see.
I think it was continuing bonds from
Yes,
Deborah.
continuing bonds. Mm-hmm.
Did you want to speak to that, Karen?
Deborah actually wrote that, and I think it would be great to hear from Deb with the continuing bonds.
I just have to pull myself off of mute. And the continuing bonds is so important to so many people, as they, connect with their loved ones, in nature. And however you look at it, whether it's the dog you see, that's sitting next to you named George is eating ice cream and your husband loved ice cream. People look out for any connection, out there in the world, to give them some comfort in their hearts. As we see the relation to butterflies and the dragonflies and what have you, anything that's alive in nature, people are connecting to the cardinals.
I do see somebody in the comments talks about, I grew up in Buffalo, Lauren. I spent almost all my summers as a child near Buffalo on a farm there. And she writes, by Lilydale, and lived in Orlando by Casadega. And to visit either of these places now definitely shows the wane away from these particular camps. That's interesting. Brief visit to Casadega 5 years ago showed a community that was falling to disrepair. That's interesting.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Karen.
Oh, I was going to say, David said, I often have to clarify that talking with our loved ones or writing them letters and journaling with them is not this kind of literal spiritualism, but a work of the imagination and heart. Do others counsel this too? It's interesting.
It is interesting. I do that, but I don't do it with that intention. I think I just do it as part of how I want to share with people some suggestions to journal, but I don't do it with that intention. And that's really interesting. I probably will now for the rest of my career.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to, when working with folks in that respect, sort of really just try to meet them where they are, and do my best to sort of step back from defining it in any particular way whatsoever. And actually sometimes find there's a lot of power in being able to step back and say, well, you know, we can look at this from a psychology perspective or a philosophy perspective. We can look at it from a spiritual perspective. And, you know, so the perspective or the lens that we use is not necessarily, you know, the proof or the explanation. It's the fact that there's so many ways of encouraging and seeking those continuing bonds that we don't necessarily have to be able to answer the question of, you know, where are they coming from in order to experience comfort or joy or connection. So I try to be sort of purposefully vague in that regard and not necessarily define for others, you know, where I think that connection might be coming from.
Interesting. Thank you.
And going back to Molly's question about sitting with the grief of the institution of slavery, I think Dr. Don, you did a great job with in your going through this history of really validating our experience with grief, and that to have grief over the institution of slavery is very human, and to have grief over any type of collective grief experience is very human. I think the important thing is validating that experience for anyone, whatever they may define it as, because if we don't, then it can become disenfranchised. And, you know, maybe we are looking at groups of people that are experiencing disenfranchised grief because their loss and grief has not been validated or socially mourned in a way that we thought. So I think you did a great job in giving that history and really helping us to understand that in context of this.
Well, then you just did a great job framing that. Thank you. Any other questions I should address, or do we want to go to the next slide? I'm conscious of the time. Let's go to the next slide. So the third and fourth, third and last stanza of Old Walt's poem, this is probably one of the last pictures taken of Old Walt. Really, really worn by that time in the Civil War. He writes a lot about it beyond this poem. On I go, open doors of time, open hospital doors, the crushed head I dress, poor crazed hand, tear not the bandage away. The neck of the cavalryman with the bullet through and through I examine, hard the breathing rattles, quite glazed already the eye, yet life struggles hard. Come, sweet death, be persuaded, O beautiful death, in mercy come quickly. From the stump of the arm, the amputated hand, I undo the clotted lint, remove the bandage, wash off. Back on his pillow, the soldier bends with curved neck and side-falling head. His eyes are closed, his face is pale. He dares not look at the bloody stump, and has not yet looked on it. I dress a wound in the side deep, deep, but a day or two more, foresee the frame all wasted and sinking, and the yellow-blue countenance of their skin I see. I dress the perforated shoulder, the foot with the bullet wound, cleanse the one with a gnawing and putrid gangrene, so sickening, so offensive, while the attendant stands behind me holding the tray and pail. I am faithful. I do not give out. Through a fractured thigh, the knee, the wound in the abdomen, these and more I dress with impassive hand, yet deep in my breast a fire, a burning flame. Thus in silence, in dreams' projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms around this neck have crossed and rested, and many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips. Next slide. A lot of people, a lot of historians would say that Walt Whitman never recovered from the Civil War. A lot of historians, including Ken Burns, who made the film of the same name, would say that America itself has never completely healed from the Civil War. But one of the things I really wanted to do today was help draw those lines, help be able to connect those dots, help us put this modern day occupation that we all occupy as grief and bereavement professionals, help us put it in some historical context. I hope that was the sense you got today from what I had to say. Next slide, please. And so we have about 2 minutes left for any last desire of comments or questions.
Somebody said for continuing bonds, I often use a phrase like fostering a connection with your loved one. A colleague thinks that may indicate spiritualism. She uses the phrase more like honoring deceased.
So this is a sidebar for Kristen Emerson, who made the comment. What part of the country are you in? Because for me, even though I grew up on the East Coast, I've spent the last 35 years on the West Coast, it wouldn't even occur to me that looked like spiritualism. And I wonder if it's because you are proximal to where spiritualism is particularly active, not necessarily Mid-Atlantic South. Okay, that's interesting. I think we could use a graduate level seminar on this, yeah. Anybody else on the panel like to make any closing comments? Well, then let me just say how much fun it was to put together this presentation. I learned a lot doing it. Again, I especially wanted to try to put all that was there into some historical context. As you can tell, an hour is nowhere near enough to explore all the issues that came up for some of you in your questions, and that still come up for me. So thank you for attending today. Blessings, and we'll see you next time.
We actually have one last question. So for the soldier fighting, was the Civil War the beginning of offering benefits to those who die in battle?
The answer is yes. And that's very well validated as not only it was where they began to get those benefits, but how the government had to grow to come along with it. And sidebar, that's where the term red tape comes from, because all of the files that were kept on each soldier getting benefits were wrapped in red ribbon.
That's fascinating. Thank you, everyone. That concludes today's chat. And thanks so much for all of your wonderful information. Dr. Dunn, this was just so informative. I'm a total history nerd, so I loved it. And thank you so much to the Bereavement Steering Committee, as well as all the attendees. As a friendly reminder, today's chat recording will be available on the Bereavement Professional Community Library here in a few days, alongside the slides. Please join us next time, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much, everyone.